The unseen power. Clara's journey had never been an easy one. She had come from nothing, a child raised in the roughest neighborhoods where hope often seemed like a luxury. Her parents had worked hard, but their efforts were often overshadowed by the relentless weight of systemic inequality and economic hardship. Clara had learned early on that she would have to fight for every inch of success, that nothing would come easy for her, and that no one would hand her the life she dreamed of. As a young woman, Clara had joined the workforce with no illusions about what her role would be. She took on the jobs no one else wanted, cleaning offices, washing floors, and scrubbing toilets in high-rise buildings where the wealthy executives looked down on her from their glass offices. She knew she wasn't meant to stay in these positions forever, but at that moment, survival had been her primary concern. She worked late into the night, often well after the building's occupants had gone home, so she could care for her family during the day. But Clara had a secret, one that only a few people knew. She wasn't just cleaning to get by. She was observing, studying the very people who looked down on her. The world of finance, business, and leadership fascinated her. While the executives enjoyed their lavish lives, discussing their next big acquisition or their latest round of golf, Clara was gathering knowledge, about leadership styles, about managing people, about what worked and what didn't in the world they inhabited. And as she watched, Clara realized something critical: the very people who thought of themselves as the pillars of success, the ones in suits and ties, were often the ones who had lost their way. They made decisions based on their egos, focused solely on profits, and ignored the people who made the company run smoothly, employees who sacrificed their time, their energy, and sometimes their very well-being, just to keep things going. It struck Clara deeply, and she made a vow to herself that if she ever had the chance, she would build a company that didn't ignore the people at the bottom. She would rebuild, from the ground up. When the opportunity came, Clara didn't hesitate. A small tech company, once a leader in the industry, was on the brink of bankruptcy, struggling under the weight of its own failures. The company had once been admired, revered for its innovation, but somewhere along the way, it had lost its direction. Its leadership had become bloated and out of touch with reality, and the employees had suffered for it. Clara saw an opportunity, a chance to not only save the company but to show the world that the real power wasn't in the hands of the few but in the collective strength of those who truly understood what it meant to work for success. Clara didn't let her status as a janitor stop her from taking action. She had invested her savings, secured funding through her hard-earned reputation in the business world, and made her move. The deal was quiet, discreet. No one knew it at the time, but the company's future had just changed hands. Clara was now the owner, the one who held the keys to the kingdom. Yet, she didn't come in as a CEO right away. No, she had a plan. She would stay in the shadows, remain the cleaning lady, and observe. She wanted to understand the company from the inside out. To her, this wasn't just about business, it was about understanding the culture, the people, the dynamics that had caused the company's fall from grace. She wasn't in a rush to put her name on the door. Instead, she chose to become an invisible observer, taking on the role of janitor to experience the workplace from a completely different perspective. Clara's movements were careful, measured. She pushed the mop with an almost meditative rhythm, as if the very action was a way to clear her mind, even as it gave her the chance to study the people who worked around her. The executives in their expensive suits never gave her a second glance. They were too consumed with their own power struggles to notice the quiet woman in the corner, cleaning their messes while they destroyed what little was left of the company's soul. She overheard everything. The conversations in the break room about cost-cutting measures, the whispers in the hallways about which departments would be laid off first. The senior managers argued over who should take the fall for the company's financial troubles, none of them willing to take responsibility. The culture of fear and manipulation was rampant. Clara watched as employees with years of loyalty to the company were treated like pawns in a game they didn't even understand. And yet, amidst the chaos, Clara's resolve only grew stronger. She wasn't just a passive observer. She was collecting information, she was learning what made these people tick, what motivated them, what broke them. It became clear to her that the company's leadership was rotten to the core, driven by greed and ego rather than a genuine desire to improve the company or the lives of the people who worked for it. Clara was no stranger to the bitter sting of humiliation, and she had tasted it time and time again throughout her life. But this time, it was different. The very people who had laughed at her, who had belittled her and tried to dismiss her as nothing more than a cleaner, were the ones who would soon feel the consequences of their actions. They had no idea who she was or what she was capable of, and Clara had no intention of revealing herself until the time was right. For now, she was content to move through the building unnoticed, absorbing the dysfunction around her, knowing that in due time, she would have the power to change it all. She could feel it in her bones. This was her moment. The company might be crumbling, but Clara had a plan to rebuild it, and it would start with the most important asset of all, the people. Every night, as she cleaned the boardroom, Clara couldn't help but smile to herself. The decisions that were being made here, the plans for layoffs, the calls for cuts, the disregard for employees, were all part of a narrative she was writing. The executives had no idea that they were just characters in her story, and Clara was the one holding the pen. The tables would soon turn, and when they did, Clara would be the one calling the shots, not them. She finished her task and made her way out of the room, her eyes scanning the hallway one last time before she exited the building. She passed the security guard, offering him a polite nod, her face unreadable. No one knew it, but Clara had already begun the process of turning things around. The storm was coming, and when it hit, no one would be able to avoid the fallout. The power she held was silent, almost invisible, but it was there. And soon, the world would see it for what it was, a force that could change everything. A woman among men. As Clara stood quietly in the corner of the boardroom, sweeping the floors and wiping down the polished surfaces, she took in everything around her. The chatter among the executives was a familiar sound now, almost a backdrop to the steady rhythm of her movements. But this time, Clara's thoughts were not on the floors she was cleaning or the tasks at hand. She was focused on the conversations, the power plays, the subtle nuances in the way people spoke to one another. Every word, every gesture, was a clue in the puzzle she was piecing together. The CEO, a man named Richard Whittaker, was leaning back in his chair with his feet propped up on the table. His suit was crisp, his posture confident, but Clara could see through the facade. His arrogance was a mask for the desperation that simmered beneath the surface. Whittaker had been in charge when the company's downfall had begun, and now, in his attempts to salvage whatever was left, he had become blind to the realities around him. He wasn't a leader anymore, he was a man scrambling to hold on to the last remnants of power. Beside him sat a group of his senior managers, men who had climbed the ranks by bending the rules and using people as stepping stones for their own success. They spoke in polished tones, filled with corporate jargon, but Clara could see the cracks. They were more concerned with their own careers than the future of the company. It was all about the next promotion, the next deal. Their eyes glimmered with the empty hope that a merger or acquisition would save them, but they weren't looking at the right things. They weren't listening to their employees, and they certainly weren't willing to put in the work needed to fix what had been broken for so long. Clara could hear them discussing numbers, talking about reducing the staff in order to streamline operations, as if people were nothing more than resources to be optimized. The HR director, a woman named Laura Parks, suggested cutting the customer service department, claiming that automation would be more efficient in the long run. Clara felt her jaw tighten. It was a decision that would destroy the heart of the company, the very people who interacted with customers day in and day out, who were the face of the brand. These employees weren't numbers, they were the lifeblood of the company. The CFO, a man named Derek Stone, was advocating for deeper budget cuts, suggesting that the company could operate with fewer people and fewer resources, as long as the numbers looked good on paper. He argued that the layoffs would increase profitability in the short term, but Clara saw the bigger picture. They were not building for the future, they were eroding it, brick by brick. She had seen it all before, a company that focused only on the present, without any regard for long-term sustainability, was doomed to fail. Clara moved silently through the room, avoiding their gaze, her presence barely acknowledged. The silence was profound in its own way. She wasn't the subject of their conversation. They didn't even know who she was. To them, she was just the cleaning lady, a fixture in the background, doing her job without protest, never asking for anything in return. And that was precisely why she had chosen to stay in this position, because they didn't see her as a threat. They didn't see her at all. But Clara wasn't just any woman. She was a woman with a plan, and the time was coming when she would reveal herself. As she wiped down the table where the executives were seated, Clara paused for a moment, her fingers tracing the surface of the polished wood. The room felt charged, as though something was about to change. She could feel it deep in her bones. The executives continued to discuss their next move, oblivious to the fact that the woman they were so quick to dismiss was watching them, carefully noting every decision, every betrayal of the employees they had sworn to lead. But Clara wasn't just gathering information, she was preparing herself. She knew that soon, they would understand the consequences of their actions. She would expose their greed, their lack of foresight, and their utter disregard for the people who had built the company from the ground up. They had no idea how much power she held, and Clara intended to keep it that way for now. Her mind wandered back to the day she had acquired the company. It had been a calculated risk, buying a company that had so obviously lost its way. But Clara had seen potential, even in the wreckage. The company had once been an innovator, a leader in its industry, and Clara believed it could rise again. She hadn't bought it out of mere financial interest. She had purchased it with the intention of saving it. And in order to save it, she knew she had to understand what had gone wrong. She had to see it firsthand. She wasn't just a businesswoman, Clara was a woman of empathy. Her roots were in the working class, and she knew what it was like to feel invisible, to be underestimated, to be discarded. She had built her success from the ground up, not by cutting people out of the equation but by lifting them up. She had learned that people were the most valuable asset a company could have, and if she wanted to rebuild this one, she would need to restore its humanity. But for now, she had to let the men in the boardroom play their game, completely unaware of the storm that was quietly building. They laughed among themselves, enjoying their power and their privilege, never once considering the possibility that it would all come crashing down. They were like children playing with matches, unaware of the fire they were about to ignite. Clara finished cleaning the room, taking one last look at the executives before she exited. They remained engrossed in their discussions, oblivious to her departure. As she stepped into the hallway, she took a deep breath. The time for action was drawing near. The longer she waited, the more the cracks in the foundation of the company grew. But Clara was patient. She had learned patience in her years of struggle. And now, as the owner of the company, she would wait for the perfect moment to make her move. The next few weeks would be crucial. Clara would observe more, gather more information, and most importantly, she would prepare herself to confront the people who had so casually destroyed what had once been a thriving, innovative company. But it wasn't about getting revenge, it was about creating something better. Something that valued the people who made the company what it was. She smiled to herself as she walked down the hallway, her mind already working through the details of her plan. It would take time, but soon enough, the executives would know who she was. And when they did, they would understand just how deeply they had underestimated the woman who had quietly swept their floors. Clara was no longer just the cleaning lady. She was the woman who would save this company, or destroy it entirely, depending on how those in power chose to respond. The silent watcher. Clara's routine never changed, though the dynamics of the company around her were shifting. Each day, she followed the same steps, entering the building early in the morning, donning her simple uniform, and carrying her mop and bucket as though they were a shield. But instead of simply cleaning, Clara was listening, observing, and silently cataloging the actions of the company's upper management. There was power in silence, and she knew it well. She had learned it over years of being overlooked, of being dismissed as just the cleaning lady, and now she was using that to her advantage. She knew that many of the executives, particularly Richard Whittaker, the CEO, and his inner circle, believed they were untouchable. They acted as though the company's downfall was inevitable, as if layoffs and budget cuts were the only options. But Clara could see something they couldn't. The company wasn't dying because of a lack of innovation or talent, it was dying because of mismanagement, a lack of empathy for the very people who could turn it all around. They had forgotten the soul of the company, its people. As Clara moved through the halls, cleaning offices and boardrooms, she often overheard the conversations of the senior staff. It wasn't just about the company's financial struggles, it was about their egos. The discussions were laced with power plays, each executive trying to outmaneuver the other to secure their own position. There were constant whispers of who was angling for the next promotion, who was trying to make a deal with a potential buyer, and who was already preparing to jump ship to another company once things started to fall apart. Clara had heard it all, but there was one conversation that stuck with her more than the others. It happened one afternoon when the CFO, Derek Stone, had cornered her in the hallway. He had been unusually friendly that day, a stark contrast to his usual aloofness. Clara could tell he was trying to gauge her, to get a feel for who she really was. Perhaps he was testing her, perhaps he was curious about why she'd been so quiet all this time. "Clara," he said with a smirk, leaning against the wall as she cleaned the nearby floor. "How's everything going with you? Not too difficult, I hope? I mean, I've been meaning to talk to you. You've been with us for quite a while, haven't you?" Clara raised an eyebrow, keeping her gaze steady as she worked. She had learned long ago to keep her responses vague, to avoid offering anything that might give away her true identity or intentions. She could sense the shift in Derek's tone, the subtle hints that he might be testing her loyalty. "It's fine, Mr. Stone," she replied evenly, keeping her voice as neutral as possible. "It's just work. Nothing to worry about." Derek chuckled, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Of course. But you've been here for a while now. Don't you ever think about moving on? I mean, there's so much potential for growth here, but you've got to wonder if it's worth it with how things are going." He lowered his voice slightly, as if trying to confide in her. "You're a smart woman, Clara. You must see the writing on the wall. This company, it's on the edge. We're doing our best to keep things afloat, but I can't promise you much longer if things don't change. The new CEO might make some tough decisions, you know? Might even bring in fresh blood." Clara's pulse quickened, but her expression remained unchanged. She knew exactly what Derek was hinting at. He was attempting to gauge her position, trying to see if she was loyal to the existing leadership or if she was someone who might be swayed by the notion of better opportunities. He didn't know that she was already the one who would make those decisions. "I'll be fine, Mr. Stone," Clara said, keeping her tone nonchalant. "I'll just keep doing my job." Derek gave her a long look, as if trying to read her. Clara met his gaze with an inscrutable calm. He didn't know, couldn't possibly know, that she was the one holding all the cards. As he walked away, still lost in his own thoughts, Clara felt a small surge of satisfaction. She had managed to keep up the facade. She had gained more insight into the inner workings of the company, and she had reaffirmed her belief that these executives were more concerned with saving their own skin than with saving the company. Over the next few weeks, Clara continued to observe and learn. Every corner of the building, every conversation, every meeting, revealed more about the company's broken structure. The executives continued their endless discussions about cuts and layoffs, and Clara continued her silent vigil, watching them unknowingly paint their own downfall. But it wasn't just the executives who needed to be held accountable. The mid-level managers, those who had become complacent in their roles and had no true leadership skills, were just as much a part of the problem. They were the ones who perpetuated the toxic culture that permeated the building, the ones who passed down orders with no regard for their impact on the employees who were the true engine of the company. One afternoon, as Clara cleaned the break room, she overheard a conversation between two of the department heads, Mark and Angela. "Have you heard the latest?" Mark was saying, his voice low but urgent. "The CEO is thinking about laying off the entire IT department next week. They're talking about outsourcing the work." "Can you believe it?" Angela scoffed. "Honestly, I'm not surprised. We've been hearing talk about cost-cutting measures for months now. It's just a matter of time before he starts firing people. But I don't think he cares. It's all about protecting his position, right?" "I hear that," Mark said, nodding in agreement. "I don't know how long we can keep up this charade. Everyone is on edge. We're supposed to be a family here, but no one feels like they belong anymore. People are just looking out for themselves now." Clara paused in her cleaning, her heart heavy. She had always known that the soul of the company had been eroded, but hearing it from the people within the company itself made it all the more real. These were the voices of the workers, the people who kept things running, yet they were ignored and left behind. They were the ones who felt the weight of the decisions made in the boardrooms. They were the ones whose lives were disrupted by corporate greed and short-sightedness. Clara knew that it was time to act. The truth of what had happened to the company was becoming clearer with each passing day. The leadership had abandoned its people, but Clara was determined to restore what had been lost. She had a plan, one that would involve more than just firing the executives or revamping policies. It was going to take a complete overhaul, a shift in the very foundation of the company. Clara had come to realize something profound. This wasn't just about saving a company from financial ruin. It was about restoring dignity to the people who had been treated as nothing more than disposable tools. And she wasn't going to let it go. No matter what it took, she would be the one to bring true change. As she finished her work that day, her eyes once again swept across the boardroom. The executives were still deep in discussion, their voices a blur of numbers and jargon. They couldn't see her, couldn't know what she was thinking. But Clara could see them. She saw through their masks, through their lies, and through their misguided ambitions. Soon, they would know who she really was. Soon, they would understand that the power they had taken for granted no longer rested with them. It was in her hands now. She smiled to herself as she walked out of the room, knowing that the time to reveal herself was getting closer. The company would soon know the truth. The woman they had overlooked was the one who would lead them to redemption, or bring them crashing down. The reveal. The next morning, Clara walked into the building as usual, her steps measured and deliberate. The mop in her hand felt heavier than usual, but it wasn't the weight of the task, it was the weight of the decision she had made the night before. She had been thinking long and hard about how to make her presence known. The time for silence was over. She had watched, listened, and gathered all the information she needed. Now, it was time to act. She had been planning this moment for months, carefully laying the groundwork, carefully choosing when and how to reveal herself. Every step she had taken up to this point had been a means to an end that was now within her grasp. Clara knew that this wasn't going to be easy. She had spent years hiding in the shadows, and revealing herself would inevitably shake things up, potentially causing a storm. But she also knew this was the right thing to do. The company needed a leader who understood the value of people, a leader who wasn't just interested in profits but in the lives that were affected by every decision made in those cold, glass-walled offices. The day had come. As she entered the boardroom, she could feel the tension building. She had arranged this meeting under the guise of an ordinary corporate session, nothing unusual, just a standard meeting where key players would discuss strategy and plans. But this time, the meeting was about to take a turn no one expected. The executives were seated around the table, papers in hand, already engaged in their typical back-and-forth conversations about budgets and layoffs. Richard Whittaker, the CEO, was at the head of the table, looking even more disheveled than usual. His eyes were bloodshot from late nights spent trying to salvage his crumbling empire. The others followed suit, exhausted and frantic, caught up in the futile attempts to find a quick fix for a company that had long since lost its way. Clara moved silently into the room, the sound of her mop wheels rolling against the floor barely audible over the heated exchanges at the table. Her heart raced, but her face remained impassive as she quietly pushed her bucket to the far corner of the room, close enough to hear every word. This wasn't the moment to reveal herself, not yet. She needed to wait for the right moment, to make sure the full weight of her presence would hit them when they least expected it. The CEO's voice rose above the others, filled with frustration. "We're running out of time. If we don't cut costs immediately, we're looking at a massive financial collapse. You all know what needs to be done, but I need your full support. This restructuring has to happen, no exceptions." The CFO, Derek Stone, nodded solemnly. "I agree, but we need to take more drastic measures. It's not just about cutting a few departments. We need to shed as much weight as possible. Outsourcing, layoffs, nothing is off the table." Clara clenched her fists at her sides as she listened. It wasn't just their words, it was their complete detachment from the reality of the people they were affecting. Every name they mentioned, every department they targeted, were real people. Employees with families, with hopes, with dreams. But in the eyes of these men, they were just statistics, a cost to be reduced in order to save face. Clara could feel the injustice boiling inside her. She waited, watching their every move. Finally, as the conversation reached a fever pitch, Clara knew it was time. With a small, deliberate push, she moved her mop to the center of the room, silently cutting through the air between herself and the men at the table. Her movements were slow, measured, but there was a quiet power in them. She could feel the shift, the room's focus was beginning to slide toward her. Their eyes briefly flickered toward the woman cleaning the floors, but they quickly dismissed her. The floor was dirty, and she was just the cleaner, after all. No one saw the fire in her eyes, the quiet storm that had been brewing for months. Clara moved to the far side of the room, where the door to the conference room stood ajar. For a moment, she stood there, her back to them, her mop resting against the floor. Then, slowly, she turned around and walked to the head of the table. "Excuse me, Mr. Whittaker," Clara said, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight. Richard Whittaker looked up, startled. He was so used to ignoring the cleaning staff, so used to pretending they didn't exist, that he almost didn't recognize her. But there was something different about her today. The calm in her voice made the air feel thick with expectation. "I believe there's something you need to see," Clara continued, her tone still steady but now laced with an authority that caught everyone off guard. The room fell silent. The executives exchanged confused glances, unsure of how to respond. Finally, Derek Stone raised an eyebrow, clearly irritated by the interruption. "What are you doing here, Clara? We're in the middle of a meeting." Clara's expression didn't waver. She met Derek's gaze, and there was a moment of recognition in her eyes, though he couldn't quite place it. "I think it's time you all learned something." Without another word, Clara reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a small stack of documents. She placed them carefully on the table in front of Richard Whittaker, watching as his hands trembled slightly when he saw the papers. "What is this?" he asked, his voice more defensive than curious. Clara took a deep breath before responding. "This is the ownership deed to this company. I am the one who bought it out. I own it. All of it." There was a collective gasp around the room. The men froze, their eyes widening as they looked from the documents to Clara, who stood before them, calm, unwavering, and now undeniably in control. "You, what? Derek asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara nodded. I bought this company a few months ago, when it was on the brink of collapse. I've been here all along, working quietly, watching, listening. I've seen the way you've treated the employees, the way you've let this company fall apart. And now, it's time for you to face the consequences of your actions. The CEO's face turned red with indignation, his eyes flaring with anger. This is preposterous. You're the cleaning lady. You. Clara held up a hand, silencing him. I'm not just the cleaning lady, Mr. Whitaker. I'm the woman who owns this company now. I've been cleaning up the mess you created. And now, it's time for you to leave. The room fell silent again. The weight of her words hung in the air, thick with disbelief. The men at the table looked at each other, unable to comprehend the truth of what was happening. How had they not known? How had they failed to see the quiet power that had been hiding in plain sight? Clara's gaze shifted to each of them, meeting their eyes with a quiet, determined resolve. You all had your chance. You had the opportunity to save this company, but instead, you played your power games and destroyed it from within. You disrespected your employees, cut them down to save your own positions, and ignored the very people who made this company what it once was. You'll be gone by the end of the day. She turned to leave, but not before leaving them with a final thought. The company will be run differently now. I'm going to restore it to what it was meant to be. And it will thrive again, without you. As Clara stepped out of the boardroom, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had done it. She had taken the company back. The executives, the ones who had laughed at her, belittled her, and attempted to fire her, now knew the truth. They had underestimated her. And now, the tides had turned. She was in charge. The real work, however, was just beginning. Clara knew that it wouldn't be enough to simply remove the old leadership. She would have to rebuild from the ground up, restore the company's integrity, revive its innovation, and above all, ensure that the employees, the heart of the company, were treated with the respect they deserved. But for now, as she stood in the quiet hallway, Clara allowed herself a brief moment of victory. She had made her move, and there was no going back now. The reckoning. The days following Clara's revelation were filled with a flurry of activity, but not the kind of activity the executives had expected. Their immediate concern was their own survival, scrambling to protect their egos, their careers, and the positions they had clung to for so long. But Clara was no longer concerned with their reactions. She had made her move, and now she was determined to reshape the company from the ground up. Within hours of the meeting, the executives who had once ruled the company were escorted out of the building. Their desks were cleared, their access revoked. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic speeches. Clara had no interest in indulging in theatrics. She didn't need to prove anything to them. Her actions spoke louder than any words ever could. But while the old leadership was being escorted out, Clara was already making plans for the future. She wasn't naive, she knew that taking down a corrupt system would leave a vacuum, and in that vacuum, chaos could easily take root. She couldn't afford to be hasty, to simply tear everything down without a clear plan for rebuilding. Clara's first priority was to reach out to the employees, the very people who had been neglected and abused for so long. She called for an all-staff meeting the very next day, a rare occurrence in a company that had long been known for its cold, impersonal environment. The employees, many of whom had seen the layoffs and budget cuts looming on the horizon, were cautious at first. Whispers spread throughout the office, "Who's the new CEO? What happens now?" The uncertainty was palpable. But Clara knew how to address it. She understood fear, she had lived with it for years. She also knew that when fear ran unchecked, it could paralyze a company, its employees, and its future. So, Clara chose transparency. The meeting was held in the company's main conference room. It was a large space, with high ceilings and sleek modern furnishings that always gave the impression of a place reserved for the powerful, the untouchable. But today, the space felt different. Clara had called for the meeting to be held in the largest room, not because she wanted to make a statement to the executives but because she wanted the employees to feel the shift in power. She wanted them to see that this wasn't just about her, it was about them. It was about restoring their place in the company, reclaiming their voices. As employees filed into the room, Clara stood at the front, her presence commanding but not oppressive. There was no need for a podium, no need for speeches laden with corporate rhetoric. She stood before them, as simple and approachable as she had always been. She waited for the noise to settle, for the room to quiet down. Then, in the calm that followed, Clara spoke. "I know many of you are wondering what happens now," Clara began, her voice steady, each word deliberate. "I know you've been through a lot, that you've seen decisions made in this company that have hurt you, decisions that didn't consider the people who made this company great. I'm not here to make empty promises. I'm here to show you that things are going to change, not because I say so, but because we're going to make it happen together." There was a murmur among the crowd, and Clara could see the skepticism in some of their faces. For years, they had been taught to distrust leadership, to believe that no matter how hard they worked, they would always be treated as expendable. They had been conditioned to expect betrayal, not change. Clara understood this. She had felt it herself, many times over. And so, she spoke with sincerity, with a vulnerability that reached across the room and into the hearts of the people who had suffered under the previous regime. "I've spent months here, not as your CEO, but as someone who has walked alongside you, cleaning these floors, observing, listening, and learning. I know what this company needs. But more importantly, I know what you need. I don't expect you to just trust me because of a title. I expect you to trust me because I've earned it. And I will earn it every day that I'm here." The employees shifted, some leaning in, others nodding. Clara continued, "The first thing I'm going to do is restore this company's soul. You are the heart of this company. You always have been. And I'm going to make sure that you are treated with the respect and dignity you deserve. The decisions that were made in the past were driven by the egos of a few people who forgot the most important thing: this company exists because of you. Without you, there is no company." Clara paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent now, the air thick with anticipation. It wasn't just the employees who were listening, it was Clara's own reckoning, her opportunity to restore justice. She knew she was stepping into an uncertain future, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a call to action. "I know many of you have been worried about your jobs. The layoffs, the cuts. I understand why you're scared. But I am committed to bringing this company back. I'm committed to investing in you, to giving you the tools and support you need to succeed. You won't be treated as numbers, as statistics. You'll be treated as the vital pieces that you are. If we want this company to thrive, we all have to thrive. And that starts with us, as a team." The employees exchanged glances, some still uncertain, others hopeful. Clara's words were starting to take root. The fear wasn't gone, but it was beginning to recede, replaced by a flicker of optimism. "Today, we start a new chapter," Clara concluded. "You will have a say in how we move forward. I'll be opening lines of communication with each department, ensuring that your voices are heard. I will not make decisions behind closed doors without consulting you. And together, we will restore this company to greatness." The room was still. The employees had heard speeches before, many of them had been promises made by the very people who had betrayed them. But Clara's words felt different. She wasn't offering empty assurances, she was offering something more valuable. Respect, transparency, and a willingness to fight alongside them. It was a promise that came not from a corporate boardroom, but from the heart. As the meeting ended, Clara stood at the front, watching the employees slowly file out. There was no standing ovation, no applause, just the quiet, steady hum of people who were beginning to believe that change was not just possible, but inevitable. The work ahead would be long, and there would be obstacles along the way, but Clara was ready. In the days that followed, Clara kept her word. She met with department heads and employees alike, asking for their input and listening to their concerns. She made it clear that she wasn't just a figurehead, she was in the trenches with them, ready to roll up her sleeves and do the hard work required to bring the company back from the brink. Clara's actions spoke louder than her words. Slowly but surely, the company began to shift. The toxic environment that had once plagued the halls began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of purpose and camaraderie. Employees felt valued again, and for the first time in a long while, they were excited about the future. The road ahead was still long, but Clara had made it clear that she was the one steering the ship. She wasn't going to let the company go down the same path of ruin as before. This was her chance, not just to save the company, but to show the world what true leadership looked like. Clara was no longer just a cleaning lady. She was the architect of the company's future, the woman who had taken the broken pieces and rebuilt them into something greater. And as she looked at the faces of the employees, she knew they were ready for the journey ahead. Together, they would face whatever came next. And together, they would rise.